Welcome back to another episode of the Piano Pedagogy podcast. My name's Jacqueline Beckoff, and with me, as always, is Arianne Lacra. We both own successful music studios in Southern California, and I'm also the owner of Defined Music Teacher. How are things going this week, Arianne?
I'm hanging in there, Jackie. How are things with you?
Yeah, not much has happened with the studio this week. I'm excited to just dive into the episode.
All right.
Today, we are talking about performance, which is a broad topic. Let's see which direction our conversation goes, because just like a lot of our topics, I feel like we could spend just forever on that. So performances. Obviously, what comes to mind is recitals, right? You do recitals, don't you, Ariane?
Yeah, well, never independently, but that will change in May.
Gotcha. And how many recitals do you do every year? Two, three?
I plan to do two in my studio because that's the standard and that's what I've been used to at my other jobs.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, I also do two recitals every year. I'm excited because my recital's coming up in about a month and a half, and we are moving the venue from a church that we've been going to for quite a few years to the community college's performing arts center in the area that I live in. So we're upgrading, and it's going to be. I think it's exciting. Everyone's really excited about it.
All right. Wow, cool.
Yeah.
So was it easy to make that transition?
It was, easy in some ways. The process of getting securing the space was much more complicated. Though it's instead of just paying a flat fee like I do for the church, it's hourly based, and since they set up, there's employees that need to be paid. So it's more expensive, and it's more involved. But I think that it's worth it to get the more um, performance, the more performance specific space. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Rather than a church, this is a place that's made for performances. But we're going to have a lighting person, we're going to have a house manager, we're going to have it's quite involved.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely a lot. But performances are recitals are such high stress environments, right? Recitals can be such high stress environments. So I like to give my students other opportunities to perform, right? I do a monthly group workshop where I encourage all of my students to perform, right? I encourage all my students to perform at the monthly workshops. And I also try to get them to perform at home for family members. Do you think that performance is a stressful thing for your students?
Um, in a way, yes. I also think that it's necessary. And a lot of students come out of it with a sense of relief, accomplishment, renewed motivation. So it's kind of like for my students, and probably for a lot of students that I've seen, the build up to it, the anticipation can be, it's a nerve wracking experience to anticipate a performance. But then the afterward, the big sigh of relief, the feeling that, oh my gosh, my friends and family finally got to see everything that we've been working on in lessons. Um, that usually makes it worth it to the students.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Are your recitals required?
No.
How much how much participation do you get? Do you get almost all students participating?
Yeah, everybody that I ask, whether they can be a part of the recital, I usually get one of the following answers. Oh yeah, sure. Or no, I am going to be out of town that day, or yada yada yada. But it's good to ask months in advance and prepare months in advance, and maybe do a little bit of convincing, like, oh, it'll be all right, or like, um, we'll build a schedule so that we reach your goal for the recital. These things can sometimes help someone who would otherwise be hesitant to participate.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like that you know, my recitals are not required. Performing at the recitals is not required. But if someone chooses not to perform, then they are required to attend to support the other students, right? Because they get a chance to meet each other at workshop. They I think that that's important. I used to have my recitals be required, but I I had a very unfortunate experience with an older woman. This was very early on in my career, and I felt very self conscious at the time about um, the level of music that the majority of my students were performing. Right, this was very on, and I had a lot of feelings of inadequacy at that time. I had a lot of feelings of inadequacy at that time, and I wanted that student. She was in her 70s, but she had been playing for a long time, and she was my most advanced pianist at the time. And I really wanted her to perform because I wanted there to be advanced music, intermediate music at the recital. And she was a very anxious woman. And she performed in two recitals. And then she told me that she was going to stop her piano lessons because she didn't feel like she could say no to me when I asked her to participate in the recitals. I think that they weren't, I don't recall if they were 100, they weren't, I don't think they were officially required, but I pushed her very hard to get her to do the recitals. And I tried to backtrack, saying, I apologize that I was so forceful. I'd love to keep you on as a student. You don't need to do the recitals. But it was too late, and I lost her as a student. But I gained a very difficult lesson. I gained a very, very difficult lesson. And since that time, the recitals are not required, but attendance is required.
Wow. Yeah. What a lesson to learn. What a valuable lesson to learn for any music teacher. You know, some people
Yeah,
know their limits, and maybe not everyone is taking lessons just for the sake of eventually performing, a couple times a year. Um, I feel like maybe younger people, there's a little bit more, uh, what's the word? There's more leeway to be pushed, to perform, because with younger students who have not fully matured, they're still doing a lot of firsts, like first experiences with performing, first time playing in a basketball game, just
right.
in life. And so, there's a difference between encouraging someone who's never performed music on a stage before to perform something, uh, versus
Yeah,
maybe someone who's older and who's been through it and knows that they don't like it.
yeah, and I wonder if we perceive children as having less autonomy over their lives, right? We think subconsciously maybe that their refusal is less valid because they don't really have the experience to make an informed refusal. I know because yeah, I think I used to have it. Children are required to perform. That's how I used to do it. Children are required to perform. It's optional for adults. And thinking about it, that's really, I mean, it's not great, is it? Right? To treat children like they have less autonomy.
Yeah, as if they already have any autonomy at home. I mean,
Right.
do, but some surely don't.
Yeah. And I've I've shifted a lot on the philosophy of performances because as ever since I introduced the workshops about 4 years ago, I introduced them in January of 2020, but then obviously you know what happened in 2020. And then they were reintroduced back in person in in late 2021. Um, the my students having the opportunity to perform 14 times a year, 12 workshops plus two recitals, is
Wow.
quite a big difference to two, right? 14 versus two.
Yeah.
Um, and because of that, even at workshops, I don't require performances, but I do push students to perform, right?
Mm.
We talk about performance anxiety and how it's something that you can get over, but you have to work, you have to try, and that if you avoid performing, you're never going to become more comfortable with performing, right? Um, I push students to perform at the workshops, and um, I've only ever had one student decide not to perform in a recital since I instituted
Wow.
my I give them the choice, right? Because I don't think it's beneficial really to push that hard, you know?
Right. And after a certain point, it has to come from them, and maybe a little bit of encouragement from the parent, explaining things like cause and effect, just giving out the facts that, hey, usually once a student does a few performances, they improve a lot in how they play. And I try to make sure that anyone who is accepted into my studio is someone who's genuinely interested in the craft. Um, and as a result of that, there's a lot of privilege that comes with being able to have that discretion as a piano teacher. So this is something that has I've had a lead up to in my career. It wasn't always this way that I was able
Yeah.
to decide,
Yeah.
but this has allowed me to cultivate a studio full of people who really do want to show off what they've learned. And I find that there's a certain timing to it. When the recital starts to get into its planning stages, or the workshop, or whatever performance opportunity, um, I try to suggest a few different repertoire options with my students. And this is kind of a life hack that I've learned, that, hey, maybe something that they feel really good about playing,
Yeah.
and something that they're so proud of the way they've accomplished, maybe something that hardly requires any sprucing up at all.
You know,
If you have, hold on,
repertoire.
hang on a second, I'm not finished. And then I'll suggest another one that's more of a reach piece that they haven't polished off yet. That way, there's always that option that they can fall back on, the one that they already are very comfortable with, versus a piece of repertoire that they'd like to strive with. And then closer to the recital, I say, hey, which one did you want to go with finally?
Yeah, the repertoire is such an interesting topic, right? Do you have your students perform two, or do they just choose one of the two?
Either or. Some like to do two, some like to do one. It really just depends on where we ended up close to the
And
recital time.
and when they do two, do they do both of them in one go, or do they sit down and then come back up later?
Usually both in one go, unless the student does both piano and violin with me.
Gotcha. Um, so many thoughts on this specific topic, right? Because when I was younger and much more insecure in myself, I would months, just like 4 months in advance. Maybe not 4 months. That's exaggerating, but quite a while in advance. I would give my students music that's much more complicated than the stuff in their books, and I justified it to myself that this is an important project for them, that they are going to focus on building this piece that's longer and more complicated and memorizing it, and then use it at the recital. But I think if I'm being honest with myself, I think it was again that insecurity that I was trying to get them to play more advanced music than they were really at their level for, so that I would feel like the recitals were more um interesting, right? That they were more interesting for people to listen to, and I could be more proud of it. But it took so much away from their forward momentum because we would start focusing so heavily on that piece in preparation for the recital that their progress in their books and in their reading skills and in, you know, all of that stuff, it would just come to a halt because we just didn't have the time to work on that. So my students were progressing very slowly through their levels, but twice a year playing very complicated music relative to what they were doing. And I think that that was a really, really bad decision on my part. And I don't do that anymore. Now, I don't bring in more complex repertoire for them. They play something from one of the books that they've been working on, right around 2 months in advance. For my elementary students, I say, all right, the recital's coming up. Let's pick something either that we're currently working on that you really like, or something that you've recently done that you've liked, and then we start memorizing that one early, and then as we get closer to the recital, we I try to loop in another piece that's more advanced because they've spent more, more time on it, right? But as a result, they learn more quickly, even if their music isn't as complicated at the recitals.
Yeah, I mean, so much of it is just like mental. And I think the more advanced a student is, the more leeway you have with, and the more of a rhythm you
Yeah,
know that that particular student. What kind of Hail Marys can they throw under pressure? Because
right,
some of my students, they thrive on recitals because they're in it for the performance aspect, and they love to entertain. Those are the students that usually surprise me the most because their preparation for the recital is so intense that sometimes they even bring in their own works that I had no idea they were preparing. And they'd be like, hey, can I play this too? I really want to impress my, whoever is
right.
watching. So a lot of it is social. You want to stand out among your peers. It's really interesting.
Yeah, it's absolutely, the more advanced a student is, you can absolutely give them a reach piece, right? You can give them a piece that requires something that is beyond them, right? And that's good. It's a motivator, just like juries in university, right? You get this stuff beyond what anything you've ever done before, and you have 16 weeks, right? And that's absolutely an incredible motivator. And I think that the biggest thing that students need is they need exposure to performances, right? They need a significant exposure to performances because it's a skill, right? It's a skill that needs to be exercised, just like improvisation is a skill. You can't expect students to improv fluently and effortlessly if they do it twice a year, right? Or if they only practice dynamics twice a year, right? The lesson is only so helpful in giving practice for performances, right? One of the things that I do is, my more students that have been with me for longer, they'll do two pieces, right? Usually for a student's first recital or first two recitals, they'll do one piece, and then for their second, as they get further, I'll give them two pieces, and they will go up two separate times at the recital. And my logic behind that is not only, and this is a little bit vain, it pads out the recital a little bit, but it is also, I feel like, educational because they get to the experience of bowing and walking up. They get that experience twice. They get the butterflies. They get the anxiety. They learn to deal with that twice for every recital rather than once.
Yeah, yeah, and the first time versus the next in one recital, it's always going to be different. It's always going to be easier. Maybe the initial nerves are out of the way.
Yeah, and it helps
Yeah.
give them some autonomy because I can ask them, well, which piece do you want to do first? right? Which piece do you want to do first in the recital? Like, do you want to do this one? Do you want to do the harder one first, get it out of the way? You want to do the easier one so that you're more prepared for the harder one? And every student has their preferences, and it's a way to give them some autonomy in their performance. Because if you think about it, it's like a little tiny version of programming for them. Because when we put together our recitals, or when in university, or when a concert pianist puts together a performance, they're deciding which one goes first, what happens after that, the flow of it. So it's kind of like a tiny little moment where they get a chance to make that decision for themselves, and I think that's
Mhm.
good.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, performance order is a very quirky thing. Um, I mean, there are certain standard ways to perform certain things in order at the university level when you're a pianist, in the concert setting. So why not share that? Why not let a student participate in that decision process, right?
Yeah, and I think that it's it's helpful for them to get to choose a recital piece, and if they really liked something, even if it's from like months and months ago, sometimes I'll let them do that. But really, it's a beneficial experience for them. Now, when what do you require they do, right? Because as a child, different piano teachers had me do different things at the recital, right? Like some of them, I mean, most of them had me bow, right? Some of them had me say my name and what piece I'm performing. Some of
Mm.
them did that themselves. They would get up in front and they would announce the person, the student. Some of them didn't announce it, and they didn't ask me to announce it. I would just go up and play. I would sit down, and then the next person. So, what do you have your students do at recitals other than play, obviously?
Oh man, when I was growing up, I was required to do
A
a curtsy
curtsy.
with a dress. Oh my gosh, how things have changed in a short amount of time. But also, my teacher was pretty old fashioned. um, Not much, really. I'll just go up on stage, give a quick intro of the student, how long we've been working together, what they've uh, what they're going to perform, and then usually I'll have the student bow. I have run into a few students that really don't like to bow, or they'll just forget. And in the event that that bow doesn't occur, I'll just kind of shrug it off. I mean,
Yeah.
I it's one of those things.
Yeah, so you get up, you introduce them, you talk about the student and how long they've been a student, and then you
Mhm.
introduce their piece, and then they get up and they bow. That's interesting. I think that's really interesting that you talk about the student. This when I get up, I say, up next we have blah blah blah, and they're playing blah blah blah, and then I go ahead and I sit back down, and then I get up and I do that for the next student. Sometimes I will say something about the piece, but very rarely will I do that. Very rarely will I do that. But I have them bow. I have them bow and either count to three or look down and say, "Did I tie my shoes today?" And that's how long they hold their bow for. Um, and one of the biggest things that I try to drill into them is to not rush onto the piano and not rush off of the piano, right? I ask them to sit down and count to three before they put their hands on the piano. Before they're done, before they get up off the bench, I ask them to put their hands in their lap and count to three, because it looks like and they are sometimes, look like they're terrified of being up in front of everybody, and they just want to
Mm.
flee as soon as they're done with their last. Sometimes I've had students get up before they even stop playing the last note, right? They're holding on to the key and they stand up, right? Um, so I talk a lot about stage presence and how to try to convey ourselves as performers. Do you ever have students like bolt away from the piano?
After a recital, well, my violin, I've had violin students who just grab their violin, put it in that cradle hold. I don't know if you're familiar with that, and
Yeah.
then just, yeah, take off. Or well, my main thing is, like, my pet peeve is when a student and I always discuss this beforehand at recitals, like when a student either sits down, puts their hands on the keyboard, waits too long, and then starts, uh, or when a student kind of shortchanges the audience on the last note and doesn't spend enough time on that last note.
Yeah.
And I try to make sure that that just won't happen by stressing the significance of the next note, and I mean, sorry, the last note of a piece, and the importance of letting the audience sit with that last note or chord, and process it before the student takes their hands off the piano.
Yeah. One of the things I talk about is asking when a student starts being a performer and when they stop being a performer at the recital, right? And of course, the answer that I'm looking for is they start being a performer when they stand up from their seat, and they stop being a performer when they sit back down in their seat. Because that's when the audience is putting their attention onto to them as I mean, you kind of stop being a human being and you kind of start being this other thing, this performer, right? You're now um, part of something larger. And then when you sit back down, sure, you're a person again. You're just hanging out, right? But it's that performance from standing to sitting is an interesting thing to emphasize. Do you have them sit with their family, or do you have them sit in a row all together?
Ooh, I like I said, I haven't thrown my own throne. I haven't planned my own one yet, but I imagine it would depend on the space, because some recitals the students gather together backstage. Others
Yeah.
they're with families in the audience, and others they're in order in a front row. I would say to save time and avoid confusion, if there were no backstage option, I would have the students sit in the front row of the audience, in order of when who performs.
Yeah, that's what I recall the larger studio that I was part of when I was a child. That's how we did it. We were separated from our family, and that sounds terrible, but it's just, we were not separated from our family, but we were. I mean, it is kind of true. We weren't allowed to sit with our family, and I think that
Right.
kind of, I don't know. I think that especially for younger kids, like a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old, right, being separated from their family at such a young age, and then sitting with a bunch of other students, that's kind of rough.
Yeah.
Um, but we sat in the front and then we would come up in order. But I have my students sit with their families, and I just tell them that when I get up and when I say your name, then it'll be time for you to start walking up towards the piano. But I've had the funniest thing happened. And at my last recital, one of my students, he had two pieces. He gets up and I announce that he's playing. I don't remember what it was. It was one of the Faber books. I don't recall. It doesn't really matter. Yeah, but I got up and announced that he was playing piece number one, and he gets up there and he starts playing piece number two. And just where I sit, I can see their faces. I can see their faces as they're playing, and just his eyes got massive, and he just I could see the wheels turning in his brain. He's like, I can't stop. My hands are in the wrong places, but I'm playing the wrong piece. I just gotta keep going. And he managed to pull it off. I was very impressed. Managed to recover from that, but
Uh,
the second time I called him up, um, I said I made a mistake in the recital program. I said earlier that this student was going to be playing piece one when really it should have been piece two. I made eye contact with him and I said next he's going to be playing the other piece. It's just to make sure that he didn't come up and play that piece again. So I took the
ah,
fall for it, but I thought that was funny.
wow. Yeah, the things that you have to do on the fly.
Do you give out um trophies, certificates, etc. as for recital participation? I know some teachers do that.
No, no, I don't. And I've worked at places that do. I've worked at places that give participation trophies for recital performance or certificates. Um, but what I would like to institute is and this is a little bit off topic, but just like musical karate belts. So,
That's awesome.
and it's not my idea. My first employer did the musical karate system, and the students were so like they just loved it so much that it was a good way to keep track of progress. But it didn't have anything to do with the performances directly. It
Were
was
they
more
actually
like
belts?
um, well, it was quote unquote belts. They did necklaces with different colored pendants, and that
Okay,
was your karate belt. So if you were a white belt, you were just starting out. Da 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 da. Black
right.
belt, you are ready for college level.
I give out music study awards for major milestones at the end of the recital, right before we get a million pictures taken of us. Um,
Mhm.
I call up everyone who since the last recital has passed a yearly milestone, 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, etc. And I recognize people in reverse order, or no, in order of most seniority for that particular one. So, but I give the same certificate. I just changed the number. Maybe I should give out different color certificates for different amounts of years. But so was it every year that they would get a new pendant?
It was just every time that they successfully completed a teacher designed exam that would bring them to the next level. And this musical karate system was actually put together by a couple of the employees at the school where I worked. So they had their own evaluation system that was a little bit less advanced and competitive and strict than the MTAC evaluations for CN. But it had a lot of the same characteristics. You know, can you play this certain kind of scale? Can you play this
Right.
certain kind of chord progression? Can you play two pieces of repertoire in a satisfactory manner? And a little theory quiz. And if you could get through that, all of that for your level, then you advance to the next level. And I think it worked like magic for a lot of students. And it wasn't just pianists either. It was students of every instrument, including voice.
That's interesting. That's interesting. Um, I've always, I don't like the participation trophy, right? I don't like the participation trophy. I'm not a fan of that. Um, and I mean, just the idea of a trophy, like an actual, like I know some teachers give out actual trophies, and I think that's kind of weird. No shade at them for doing that, but I think that I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't give out a physical, actual trophy.
Not after just one recital. I can understand, like, another employer I had, after after going through the ranks, a different kind of thing where they gave out different colored bracelets, totally different work, totally different employer. Um, if you advanced like 5 bracelets or something, then you got a trophy. And again, nothing to do with performance, just run of the mill evaluations during class time.
Right. Yeah. I think that we initially set out this talk about performances here, but I think we've stayed pretty focused on recitals. I think we might have to revisit like um, competitions and stuff like that
Yeah.
in a later episode. But the piano recital itself is such there's so much interesting stuff you can do with the recitals format, right? I know that some people like they'll have students do collaborative works, duos, duets.
Mhm.
I'm having two students do one of those for my upcoming recital.
Great.
Do you ever do that kind of collaborative stuff at recitals?
Oh, all the time. Especially with violin students, they really need that collaboration. So whether it's a two violin double concerto or just a violin piece with some piano accompaniment, and then the young pianists especially, or the ones who are doing concerti for the first time, I'll I'll accompany them as well. Um, People at the beginner and elementary level can really benefit from duets where you're both sitting on the same bench, or you're both at the same piano, one piano, four hands.
Right.
um
Do you ever have
and
your pianists accompany your violinists?
oh, no, but maybe that's something to consider.
Like a violin sonata?
Gosh, that would be great.
Are there violin sonatinas?
Uh, yeah, must be. If so, I haven't taught any before.
That would be interesting because that kind of collaborative stuff. Yeah, I had to accompany singers in college. There was a class piano vocal collaboration, and then there's duo piano, and that some of that collaborative stuff was some of the most rewarding work that I've ever done for performances because it's just such an intimate experience to get to know someone else. And I met our mutual one of our mutual friends through duo piano,
Yeah.
and I think that it's an interesting experience to be able to give to students that that collaboration of working with another student. Do you have your students perform from memory requirement, or was it a requirement?
It's not required, but it's like a soft requirement, I guess. I basically am like, try to really memorize your piece before you go up so you don't have to worry about bringing your sheet music up on stage, yada, yada, yada. Usually works. If not, and if someone's just like, man, I just couldn't, which is pretty rare because I'm a very ear-based teacher, then I just say, yeah, take your music up. It's okay. But usually by the time I deem someone recital ready, they've already memorized their piece just from practicing it so much. It's
So
not
your students, not all of them get to perform in the recital. You don't allow all of them to perform
um
if they're not ready.
most of them do, but I try to have students memorize a lot of stuff.
Right.
So
What
so
is
no matter who that student is, it's more that I'm deeming the piece recital ready because they have happen to have it memorized. Does
Gotcha.
that make sense?
Gotcha. How long do you need to have a student before you'll put them into a recital?
Um, at least a few months. If they've signed up just 2 months prior to the recital, then I'm not going to have them participate, and that's a little bit controversial. But I don't know. It's like I don't even know them that well at that point, so I just want to spend a little bit more time getting to know them before throwing them on stage and having that one be one of their core associations with piano lessons.
Right. Yeah, I get what you mean. Yeah. Um,
But
we
what
need to
about
start
you?
what was that?
What
Well,
about you?
the shortest I've ever had a student before I put them into a recital, um, I think it's been a couple of months. Generally I won't even mention the recital to students if they're signing up. Like, I recital in April. If I have a student sign up this month in March, I probably will not. I probably won't. I do have a transfer
Mm,
student. I do have a transfer student that's been taking lessons for a while, so I'm going to try to include him in the recital.
yeah,
But
makes sense.
I wish I want performances to be a more regular occurrence because I had terrible performance anxiety as a child. It was bad. I would get up and my hands they would be shaking so bad I would hit the wrong keys. My hands would be
Mm,
sweaty. I would have trouble breathing. I think a big part of that is just because I didn't get a chance to perform frequently, right? I didn't get a chance to perform frequently. I didn't memorize music frequently. I only memorized music in the months coming up to a recital, and I never really was taught proper memorization skills. So performance was always a very stressful thing for me. It didn't
mm.
become a more relaxed thing until I got a job as a church organist in my early 20s, and
Oh my
I was performing every week, right? I was performing 45
wow.
minutes of the church service with a prelude and a postlude, and I was doing that every week. So I got over my performance anxiety real quick, right? Because
Hey,
I
there
mean,
you
there's no
go.
other choice.
Yeah, and that really speaks to the importance of maybe scattering some frequent performance opportunities in there throughout the year for your students so that they
Yeah,
can also go through what you went through when you became a church organist. Maybe not the exact same way, but
right.
just a little kind of like it.
Well, I think that was one of the big driving forces behind monthly workshops with a monthly performance opportunity, right? And then I mean, I can't imagine going back, right? I mean, I have a practice recital. I lay out the chairs in my studio,
Mm,
like in an audience kind of fashion, and I have everyone practice the recital, and that's the month. of the recital, the workshop in that month. And I couldn't imagine like my students getting up to perform at a recital, if maybe they've been taking lessons for 5 months, right? They started about as far away from that recital, right after the previous recital. And then they do their, I can't imagine having a student, a brand new student, getting up in front of 100 people and performing. Like I can't imagine putting somebody through that anymore. um
Mhm.
so if it is, and the barrier now is so much less than it used to be, right? Because you don't need your own space, you don't need to supervise a bunch of children at the same time. You can do a Zoom or a different video call for workshops, so you can get students the chance to perform in that setting on a monthly basis, right? The barrier is, there is no barrier anymore. People are so much more,
Mhm.
it's so much more acceptable to do video calls for things like that. So even if you're like a travel teacher, you don't even have a studio, right? A studio space, you can still do workshops, just host them online and get your students that chance to perform on a monthly basis. 14 versus 2, right? 14 performances versus 2. That is a
Yeah.
sevenfold difference. It is ridiculous how much of a difference that is.
Oh, yeah. Um, Going back to the whole collaborative thing, I'd say that one of the most underrated aspects of performance is collaborative playing. I mean, there's a Martha Argerich quote, and I can't quote her verbatim, but I mean, she's regarded as one of the best pianists in the world. And someone asked her, how do you do it? How do you constantly perform on stage? And I think she responded with something along the lines of, if it weren't for the collaborative nature of my performances, I would be so miserable just touring solo. um, and people are divided on this, right? I've met pianists who really would prefer to play alone. I actually might be one of those. But then the more I got into collaborative playing, the more I realized, hey, it's not so bad. It's a lot of fun. It's hard to coordinate. A lot of rehearsals sometimes,
Yeah.
especially in this day and age and in this part of the country, Southern California, where you got to drive. But um, it's so worth it. And for younger people, I mean, it's an integral part of the whole experience. So the collaboration, it's pretty underrated. And I think one of our peers in the program actually focused on
Yes, she did.
collaborative learning. No, am I wrong? I don't know. I need to go back and check about that.
I think I know what you're talking about, but I think it's a travesty that, I mean, as a young pianist, I had decent piano teachers, but I wasn't given the greatest opportunities. And like I remember getting into jazz band in high school, and
Mhm.
that being the first time I ever played with other people, and being wildly unprepared, being just wildly unprepared to even uh, keep tempo with other individuals, right?
Was
Like,
it as a were you playing the piano?
yes, I was the pianist in a jazz band,
Tough.
and it was rough. It was
Not
rough, and I
easy.
remember that like we would solo, and I would just pray that I would keep up, or I would solo for the right amount of time, because I had the hardest time keeping time, and coming playing chords for 8 bars for someone else. It was just, I mean, it was a beneficial experience for me, but I feel bad for my jazz band teacher from high school, because like I was really bad. And classical pianists, so many classical pianists or so many piano students are just isolated, not by design, but by lack of opportunities, right? If you play an instrument like the violin, do most of your students play violin in school as well?
A lot of them do. Not all, but a lot.
I mean, violin, yeah, absolutely, right? Or flute or trumpet, right? All of these instruments are basically taught in school, right? I mean, a lot of these are taught in school, and then you can get a private teacher as well. But like, I mean, I have so many students that like play another instrument, like the bass or the clarinet or the trumpet, and they are just so much better off in so many different ways
Yeah.
because of that daily collaboration that they get with other musicians. You gotta count. You have to stay in time.
You
You
have
have
to
to do
count.
rhythm because there's other people, right?
Yeah. And
And
you have to listen to yourself and others and know that balance of how much listening to others versus how much listening to self.
yeah, and that's such an important skill. And so much stuff like musicality and dynamics and all of these things, right? They're just reinforced so heavily by being in a group, right? And it's just, as piano teachers, we don't see a lot of us don't see more than one student ever at a time other than a recital, right? And they don't get to know other pianists. It's a very isolating experience. So having this opportunity to play with someone else, to have to rehearse with someone else outside of your piano lesson, it's a really significant experience. And even if your students don't get it regularly, having them do it once or twice still is like it's an experience.
At some point, I would love to just host a master class at my house that is strictly collaborative in nature. So I don't know logistically how the rehearsals would work, or if the students would be performing something that they prepared versus something that they are just sight playing on the fly with another student. But I would love to try that because it gives like a lower stakes opportunity to perform something with a peer, perhaps for one of the first times.
Yeah, my two of my students that are doing a duet, they've been using recordings of each other's parts to play along with the metronome, and they're going to get a rehearsal or two. But at the workshop this month, I'm going to do a masterclass style lesson with them, which is something I've
Mm.
never done before. Right? In college, our workshops with our teacher obviously involved teaching. Right? We would get to reserve that teaching on a weekly basis. I've never done that. I feel very anxious about it. And I don't know how students would feel about it, right? I don't know how students would feel about being taught in front of another peer. But for the sheer necessity, I am being forced into this. I'm forcing myself into this by making myself. Uh, I mean, they need to be coached. I'm not going to put them at the recital if I haven't had a chance to work with them both at the same time. So we're going to
Mhm.
take 10 or 15 minutes from the workshop and we're going to go through it. We're going to talk about phrasing, dynamics, voicing, all of that stuff as a duo. And I'm excited. Maybe it'll lead to more masterclass style teaching in my workshops.
Yeah, and one thing you can do in order to prepare individual students during their just one-on-one lessons with you for things like that is to provide a recording of the other part, preferably one that could be sped up and slowed down as they see fit. Maybe on music score, excuse me. That's a lot of work. Or maybe if you can find a recording on YouTube and then you can go to the settings and change the speed, what playback speed, whatever you want. But yeah, that way if you give one part to one person, if you give the primo part to the secondo player and the secondo part to the primo player, and what I mean by part is the recording, then they can both rehearse with a recording at home, and then know what to expect and know what to listen for when they actually are collaborating with each other.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that like collaborative performance is such an interesting modality. It's such an interesting way of making performances different, right? I know some teachers like they'll do like a coffee shop thing. They'll bring a keyboard to a coffee shop and their students will play. They're not like there's it's not an audience. They're just having coffee, right? Or some people will go for minor recitals. I have a colleague who does major and minor recitals. Minor recitals are things like she'll go to an assisted living facility and her students will play,
Mm.
or she'll do a video recital and she'll have her students record a performance and then she'll edit them together. And then, of course, she has her major recitals with a large audience. But that idea of major and minor recitals is interesting, and it's also it's a fun twist on major and minor. But I think we need to start wrapping up. What do you think, Ariane?
Sounds good to me. We covered a lot of ground today.
Yeah. So big takeaways. What is our big takeaway here, Ariane? What do you
I think
think?
my takeaway is I should probably start planning some more performance opportunities for my students. Right now, I just do a couple of recitals, haven't really done a master class at my house yet, but I would love to try it.
Yeah, I think I'm 100% in agreement with you. More performance opportunities, right? More performance opportunities. And not only is it incredible for your students, it's also great when you're talking to potential students, potential parents, right? My students, instead of 2 performance opportunities every year, they get 14 performance opportunities every year. And that's
Wow.
7 times different, right? And it's a very powerful line because it's a very powerful experience for them. I noticed that since they started having the opportunities at their recitals, they've been so much more at ease during their recitals. So if you're out there and you're listening, if you do 2 recitals, try to get your students more performance opportunities, low stakes performance opportunities where there
Mm,
is not 100 people watching, there's not 50 people watching, there's 6 of their peers that they meet at workshop, right? Or maybe they're
mhm.
doing this online, or maybe they're just recording videos, right? Try to get something else other than just 1 or 2 recitals a year because those are large. You don't want performance to only be associated with stress.
Right.
Well, I think that's it for us today. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.